You think ground beef recipes are boring and predictable? Think again. Your grandparents transformed humble hamburger into dishes so creative and satisfying they've been lost to time. Let's dig into 2 hours of 60 vintage ground beef recipes only your grandparents knew. Making stock with beef bones and scraps was a habit rooted in a no-waste philosophy that defined Grandma's cooking. Whenever bones or trimmings were left behind, they weren't discarded. They went into a pot with water, vegetables, and seasonings. Slowly simmered, they produced a rich, flavorful broth that became the base for soups, stews, or gravies. This was how every part of the animal was respected and used to its fullest. The stock added depth to meals, turning simple ingredients into something layered and comforting. Families may not have realized it at the time, but that broth was what gave soups their soul. It was economical too, as it stretched meals further without requiring new ingredients. Today, many people buy boxed stock, but the homemade version was a staple of kitchens that couldn't afford waste. It carried the aroma of patience, filling the house with warmth while it simmered away. The act of making stock wasn't just thrifty, it was symbolic of a time when resourcefulness shaped every meal. It ensured that nothing ever went unappreciated and that even scraps had the chance to bring nourishment and comfort back to the table. Before it made its comeback on social media, beef and tater tot hot dish was already a legend in Midwest kitchens. You browned your ground beef with onion, layered it in a casserole dish, topped it with a can of cream soup, mushroom, celery, chicken, and crowned it with frozen tater tots. Then you baked it until it bubbled. The tots crisped up, the meat stayed saucy, and the whole house smelled like a snow day with nothing else to do but eat. It was cheap, easy, and had everything: protein, carbs, salt, and memory. This dish was never about nutrition. It was about morale. It showed up at church dinners, weeknights, and holiday leftovers. It was a blank canvas, too. Add corn, peas, cheese, whatever needed using. The best versions were a little sloppy, with crisp edges and soft centers. The first scoop might burn your tongue, but no one waited. It was casserole as comfort, and it worked. A meal that made you forget the weather, the bills, and the stress, just for a minute. Chow mein hot dish was a Midwestern potluck legend. It walked into the room carrying the scent of soy sauce and sizzling beef and left behind nothing but an empty casserole dish and a few requests for the recipe. Born sometime between post-war optimism and the suburban casserole boom, this dish took inspiration from Chinese-American takeout and made it its own. Ground beef was browned with chopped onions and celery, then mixed with a savory sauce, usually soy sauce and a can of cream of mushroom soup. That combination might sound odd, but it made everything come together with a velvety, umami-heavy punch. But the real fun started when you dumped a whole can of crunchy chow mein noodles right on top before baking. But if that flavor combination sounds bold, buckle up, because the next dish on this forgotten road trip adds soda to the skillet and somehow makes it work. Clay pot slow cooking was not just a recipe. It was a way of pulling flavor out of the earth itself. Native American communities would form thick-walled pots from river clay, baking them slowly in open fires until they were strong enough to hold the richest stews and slow-roasted meats you can imagine. The secret was patience. Cooking meat in these pots over smoldering coals allowed the juices to stay trapped inside, cycling through the dish again and again, infusing every bite with pure, concentrated flavor. No fancy Dutch oven, no stainless steel miracle cookware. Just ancient craftsmanship and a bond with nature so strong you could taste it. The slow, even heat of a clay pot gave even the toughest cuts of meat a tenderness you would not believe unless you had tried it. In a world before timers and thermostats, this was real mastery. And the taste? It was as close to magic as food can get. But clay was not the only tool they used to summon incredible flavors. Sometimes, the real secret was hidden in something even lighter than air, something that grew tall all around them: corn husks. Ground beef. Hot dish was the heart of the Midwest in a single baking pan. Ground beef browned with onions, noodles, cabbage, and canned soup came together in layers of creamy, cozy satisfaction. It was not fancy. It was practical, filling, and made with love. The cream of mushroom was the secret ingredient that turned scraps into something indulgent. Housewives baked it until bubbling, the top golden, the aroma filling every corner of the house. It was a dish that brought families together without fanfare, eaten from mismatched plates at kitchen tables worn smooth by years of use. The hot dish represented a generation's creativity, proof that with a few cans, some leftovers, and a bit of heart, anyone could feed a family well. It was the kind of meal that left no one hungry and no one forgotten. Some topped it with breadcrumbs or tater tots, giving it a little crunch to contrast the creamy middle. Others swapped ingredients as needed, corn for noodles, cabbage for peas, but the result was always the same, something comforting, familiar, and warm. Ground beef hot dish was more than food. It was connection, community, and the taste of shared survival wrapped in steam and love. Ground beef and wild mustard greens. Stir-fry was the kind of meal that showed up fast and disappeared even faster. This was not some high-end stir-fry piled with expensive sauces either. It was a down-home skillet sizzler made with ground beef cooked hot and fast, tossed with handfuls of peppery wild mustard greens, plucked fresh from wherever you could find them. Those greens had bite, real bite, and they gave the beef this sharp, earthy pop that plain old spinach could only dream of. A splash of vinegar, a sprinkle of salt, and maybe a little bacon grease if you had it lying around, and you had a dish that punched way above its weight. It was light enough for summer, hearty enough for winter, and cheap enough to keep families fed when money was just a rumor. Stir-fries like these were the ultimate in practical magic, a fast meal that felt like you had been planning it all day. And if you thought a pile of spicy greens and sizzling beef was as good as it gets, just wait until you bite into a crispy pocket filled with beef and roasted roots, the kind of thing great-grandma used to make when the nights got cold. Binding with evaporated milk was one of those subtle secrets that most people never realized was happening behind the scenes. Canned milk was a pantry staple, always on hand when fresh milk couldn't be counted on, and Grandma knew exactly how to use it to improve ground beef. Adding just a splash into meatloaf or burger mixtures gave the beef a tenderness it wouldn't have otherwise. It softened the texture, made it more cohesive, and added a richness that made the dish taste like more than the sum of its parts. The slightly concentrated flavor of evaporated milk also enhanced seasonings, blending them through the meat in a way that felt balanced and smooth. For many households, it was an invisible step that made the difference between a dense, heavy loaf and one that cut easily and stayed moist. This was a time when nothing in the pantry went ignored, and canned milk was versatile enough to become a secret weapon in savory as well as sweet cooking. Today, we pass by evaporated milk without thinking, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was part of the quiet magic that made ground beef meals taste better than you remembered. Sloppy Joe pie was what you made when a sandwich was not quite enough. The sweet, tangy beef, made with ketchup, mustard, and maybe brown sugar, got spooned into a dish and topped with biscuit dough or pie crust. Then it baked until golden and bubbly. It smelled like school lunches and weekday nights. The filling was classic Sloppy Joe, but the crust gave it shape. You could eat it with a fork. You could add cheese. Some families topped it with cornbread or mashed potatoes instead. It was a recipe that adapted to whatever was in the kitchen. What never changed was how satisfying it felt. One pan, one meal, one good reason to sit down and eat. It was often made after a sandwich dinner when the meat outlasted the buns. Sloppy Joe pie made the most of what was left and still gave you something to look forward to. It was humble, but proud, made for people who did not ask for much, just something warm and maybe a little sweet. Beef and cornbread. Tamale pie was a hug from the Southwest, baked golden brown in a casserole dish. This one dated all the way back to the 1940s, when resourcefulness met regional flavor. Ground beef was the heart of it, cooked down with onions, garlic, and sometimes diced green chilies or sweet corn. Tomato paste or enchilada sauce brought the whole mixture together into something tangy, rich, and unmistakably bold. But the real showstopper was the topping, a thick layer of cornbread batter poured over the beef and baked until it puffed up like a golden crown. It was budget-friendly, filling, and packed enough punch to wake up even the sleepiest of taste buds. Families across the American Southwest and far beyond served it up with a dollop of sour cream and maybe a little salsa on the side. But if you are someone who loves the flavor of stuffed peppers but hates all the prep, the next dish was a skillet solution that changed the game. Smoking fish with wild berries for a natural glaze was one of those strokes of genius that blended necessity and creativity in perfect balance. Freshly caught fish were rubbed or brushed with mashed wild berries like cranberries, choke cherries, or elderberries, then carefully smoked over low, aromatic fires. The natural sugars in the berries caramelized slowly in the smoke, forming a delicate, flavorful glaze that locked in moisture and added a subtle, tangy sweetness to every bite. It was preservation and flavor enhancement rolled into one breathtaking technique. The berry glaze also helped protect the fish from drying out too fast or attracting insects during the long smoking process. But the magic of earthborn cooking did not stop at meat. Deep underground and right in the fire itself, native chefs had another trick: roasting tough, stubborn root vegetables until they were sweet, tender, and full of hidden strength. Cabbage and dumpling pot was a meal that filled both stomachs and hearts when little else could. It started with a pot of broth, sometimes made from beef bones, sometimes just salted water, and a heap of sliced cabbage simmering slowly until tender. Then came the dumplings, spoonfuls of soft flour dough dropped directly into the bubbling pot. They puffed up as they cooked, absorbing the savory flavor of the broth and the sweetness of the cabbage. The result was a meal thick and comforting enough to feed a family through the coldest night. It smelled like home and patience, like something that had taken time even when there was not much to spare. No one went hungry around that pot, and even the simplest ingredients tasted rich when shared with love. It was the kind of food that made silence at the table feel like gratitude. Reservation-style ground beef and wild onion tacos were the kind of everyday magic that kept folks smiling even when times were tight. Ground beef was stretched thin, seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever wild onions could be foraged nearby. If you have never tasted wild onions, you are missing out. They hit somewhere between a chive and a spring onion, with this bold, peppery snap that made plain beef sing like a church choir. Wrapped up in soft tortillas or sometimes even more fry bread, they were simple, satisfying, and straight from the heart. This was not a meal that needed fancy cheese or salsa piled a mile high. It was pure, straight-talking flavor that left you licking your fingers and hoping there was just one more taco hiding somewhere on the plate. Now, if you think beef and onions are a match made in heaven, wait until you taste how a little bit of sage could turn a beef patty into something unforgettable. Ground beef and cabbage gravy over bread was the meal you made when there was almost nothing left, and somehow it still tasted like kindness. Ground beef browned with onions and cabbage made a quick, rich gravy thickened with flour and broth. It was spooned over day-old bread or toast, soaking in until it became soft and savory. The first bite warmed the chest. The second reminded you that a meal could still feel generous even when it was not. Families called it poor man's stew, but there was dignity in its making. The cabbage stretched the meat, the bread caught every drop of flavor, and together they became something greater than the sum of their parts. It was not about indulgence. It was about care and making sure everyone got their share. Using tomato soup as sauce was one of Grandma's simplest but most dependable shortcuts for flavor. With a single can of condensed tomato soup, she could take plain ground beef and transform it into a meal that was hearty, tangy, and comforting. The soup added moisture, preventing casseroles, skillet suppers, or even simple beef and rice dishes from becoming dry or bland. Its sweet, slightly tart taste gave the meal a richness that stuck in memory, tying dishes to the familiar red and white cans stacked in cupboards across America. Families grew up with that signature flavor, recognizing it immediately as the taste of comfort. For Grandma, it wasn't about cutting corners, but about using what she had wisely. And tomato soup was a pantry item that always delivered. With one can and a pound of beef, she could have a hot dinner ready that satisfied everyone at the table. Today, the trick feels nostalgic. but back then it was a piece of kitchen magic built out of practicality and care. Savory ground beef Jell-O mold sounds like a joke now, but back then it was an actual dish you could find in cookbooks across the country. Picture this: ground beef cooked with celery and onions, mixed with tomato or beef-flavored gelatin, and poured into a mold to chill. It came out looking like a jelly-covered meatloaf, and yes, people served it with pride. The gelatin acted as a binder and preservative, letting the dish be prepared ahead of time and stored without refrigeration for longer than usual. It was a wartime or emergency pantry trick that somehow found its way into mainstream cooking in the 1960s. Housewives would slice it into wedges and serve it with saltines or a dollop of mayonnaise, believing it was elegant. It was not, but it was practical. Gelatin was cheap and available, and this dish used only one pan and required no baking. Whether it was a result of rationing, cold buffets, or sheer culinary curiosity, it definitely left an impression. Rag mop casserole was not just a recipe. It was a reflection of how weirdly wonderful American kitchens could be in the 1950s. Inspired by the popular novelty song of the same name, this dish felt like someone took everything comforting about a weeknight dinner and tossed it in a baking dish on a dare. It all started with ground beef, browned and seasoned in a skillet, then layered with canned spaghetti. You know, the kind drowning in that slightly sweet tomato sauce, and finished off with a cheesy breadcrumb topping that always ended up extra crispy. You could tell this came from a time when convenience and flavor had to shake hands in a hurry. Moms loved it because it used shelf-stable pantry staples. And in a lot of kitchens across small-town America, it was. But if you think that was comfort food turned up to 11, just wait until you hear about the next one, a dish that was practically designed to stretch $1 and fill a table. Old-fashioned stuffed peppers were a triumph of economy. Bell peppers, once cheap and plentiful, became edible bowls for a mix of rice, ground beef, and tomato sauce, the holy trinity of Depression-era kitchens. They baked slowly until the peppers softened and the filling fused into a single, savory heart. The smell of it meant Sunday had arrived, a day when the family gathered and ate together no matter what the week had been. For many, it was the closest thing to celebration they could afford. Colorful, hearty, and proud. Each pepper stood upright in the pan like a promise kept. No one would go hungry tonight. Some cooks added breadcrumbs or leftover vegetables to stretch it further. The result was always the same, a meal that filled the stomach and comforted the soul. Stuffed peppers were proof that creativity was as essential as any ingredient. Nostalgic beef and sweet corn fry casserole was the dish that looked like a mess but tasted like a memory. Imagine browned ground beef bubbling under a thick layer of golden sweet corn kernels, all tied together with a few shakes of salt and pepper and a little bit of cream if you had it. Baked until the top got crispy and the edges turned caramel brown, it was the kind of casserole that made the whole house smell like comfort. In the 1970s, every family potluck or backyard gathering had at least one version of it, usually scribbled onto a crumpled index card or passed down by word of mouth. Sweet corn was cheap, beef was precious, and when you married the two together, you got a dish that somehow managed to feel luxurious, even when times were lean. The first spoonful always hit you with that sweet, salty magic, and before you knew it, you were scraping the sides of the pan for just one more bite. And if you thought this casserole was the gold standard of hearty, simple eats, just wait until you dive into a beef and hominy masterpiece that practically invented stick-to-your-ribs cooking. Mixing in stale bread soaked in milk was one of those Depression-era tricks that turned necessity into brilliance. Instead of wasting old bread, Grandma would soften the slices in milk until they were almost mush, then fold them straight into ground beef. This gave the meat extra volume and body, while the milk kept it tender and juicy. It was a way to bulk up meatloaf, burgers, and patties without making them dry or heavy, and no one at the table felt like they were eating less meat. The bread simply disappeared into the mixture, leaving behind a moist, flavorful dish that stretched further than a pound should. This practice also reflected a mindset where nothing went to waste and every scrap was valuable. Today we might see it as a quaint old trick, but back then it was survival and comfort in one. It made meals not only possible but memorable, because they were built out of creativity as much as ingredients. With this method, Grandma could take what might have been thrown away and transform it into something hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, a true testament to the resourcefulness of kitchens from that era. Beef and cottage cheese bake sounds like a weird combination today, but it was considered smart back then. The ground beef was browned and seasoned, then mixed with egg noodles, onions, and generous scoops of cottage cheese. Sometimes there was sour cream, sometimes there was tomato sauce, but it always ended up creamy, savory, and just the right kind of filling. It was especially good for households trying to add protein without buying more meat. Cottage cheese was cheap, and it lasted longer than you expected. This was a casserole that blended dairy and meat in a way that was not fancy but worked. It came out of the oven bubbling, with a top that browned slightly and a center that held together like lasagna without the effort. You could serve it straight from the pan, and it held heat like a dream. Some versions added peas or bell peppers for color, others stayed pure and beige and soft. Either way, it filled the belly and made people happy. In a time when families were cutting coupons and stretching paychecks, this was a dinner you could count on. Simple, practical, and more delicious than it had any right to be. Wartime ration hash was not glamorous. It did not pretend to be. But in homes across America during the 1940s, it was dinner, and often a lifesaver. This dish was the ultimate answer to food rationing and meat shortages. You would take whatever you had, maybe a handful of ground beef, a bruised potato, a few limp carrots, and you made it work. Breadcrumbs or oats were added to stretch the beef as far as it could possibly go. Sometimes there were bits of canned green beans or peas tossed in, and if you were lucky, an egg to bind it all together. Everything went into a pan and got crisped until the edges browned and the bottom stuck just a bit to the skillet. Flavor gold, right there. It taught families how to use every last crumb, and it gave a warm, filling meal when the world felt cold and uncertain. But when times got a little better, and people had a bit more to spend, things got saucier, cheesier, and a whole lot more comforting. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this. You have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Cabbage and rice bake was an act of comfort disguised as frugality. Leftover rice met cabbage and beef in a casserole dish, topped with breadcrumbs or a drizzle of milk to keep it moist. It baked until tender, the top golden, the smell rich and homey. This dish was how families turned scarcity into satisfaction. It filled bellies without emptying wallets, and its leftovers reheated even better the next day. Many cooks flavored it with paprika, garlic, or tomato, each one adding their own touch of love. The rice made it stretch further. The cabbage made it wholesome. The beef made it feel complete. Served in deep scoops with bread and butter, it was more than a meal. It was reassurance that even hard times could taste good. In quiet kitchens across America, cabbage and rice bake became the taste of perseverance made edible. Fry bread beef sliders were the secret weapon at backyard parties before sliders even became a restaurant thing. Imagine little puffs of fresh fry bread, split in half, stacked high with juicy ground beef, seasoned with a wild mix of herbs and just enough kick to make you take notice. These were not your fancy brioche bun sliders either. They had a rustic, crispy bite that somehow made the beef taste even beefier. Toss on a dollop of smoky sauce or a handful of pickled onions if you were feeling fancy, but honestly, nothing beat the classic. Beef, fry bread, and maybe a thin slice of tomato if it was growing in the garden. It was the kind of food that got you running back to the table before the adults could claim the last one. You might think nothing could top biting into one of those crispy, steamy little bundles, but the next dish might just prove otherwise. Campfire ground beef and pine nut ragu was the food of the wild-hearted, cooked under open skies and eaten with smoke still clinging to your clothes. Ground beef was browned over open flames, tossed with rough-chopped root vegetables and a good handful of toasted pine nuts that added little pops of buttery crunch to every bite. There was no measuring, no recipe cards, just instincts, a big old pot, and whatever was growing nearby or tucked away in a leather pouch. Some folks stirred in a splash of bone broth, others just let the juices and sap from the piney air do the heavy lifting. And when it was finally done, thick and savory and just smoky enough to taste the journey, it was ladled out into whatever bowls or tin plates you had on hand, eaten fast because second helpings were not guaranteed. If you think a pine nut ragu can warm your bones, just wait until you sink your teeth into beef glazed with honey and tucked between golden bites of roasted acorn squash. Adding grated carrots or zucchini into ground beef was a quiet, clever trick that served multiple purposes in Grandma's kitchen. It wasn't only about making the beef stretch further, though that was a big part of it. It was also about slipping in extra nutrition without anyone noticing. Carrots added a natural sweetness that balanced savory flavors, while zucchini added moisture that kept burgers, meatloaf, or casseroles from drying out. Grating the vegetables fine meant they disappeared right into the beef, and kids usually had no idea they were eating vegetables at all. In a time when every ingredient had to be used wisely, this method made sense because it extended protein portions and made meals healthier at the same time. It also gave the beef more body and volume, turning one meal into two without anyone feeling shortchanged. This trick carried a sense of care, because Grandma knew how to make meals nourishing as well as filling. Today, with rising costs and an emphasis on hidden veggies, this old idea feels surprisingly modern. It's a reminder that cleverness in cooking was never about fancy ingredients, but about small adjustments that turned the ordinary into something bigger and better than expected. Mock Swiss steak with ground beef was not fooling anyone, but no one minded. The original called for a real steak pounded flat and simmered in tomato gravy. The ground beef version skipped all that and made a patty. You browned it in a skillet, poured canned tomatoes over it, added onions, and let it simmer. The result was part burger, part meatloaf. It was soft, it was salty, it was cheap and dependable. In homes where steak was not on the menu, this was how you pretended. People served it with mashed potatoes or egg noodles, maybe a slice of white bread for the gravy. A pound of ground beef could stretch far if you shaped it right. This recipe showed up in many cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s. It had different names: mock steak, gravy patties, poor man's steak, but the idea stayed. Make something that felt like more than it was. The kind of dinner that said, "This will do," and really meant it. Beef birds, sometimes called mock steak rolls, were the kind of food that made you feel like you were having a fancy dinner, even if the meat came from the budget bin. The idea was simple but genius. Take seasoned ground beef, flatten it out like you are making an edible canvas, roll it up with stuffing or sometimes chopped onions inside, then tie or skewer it like it is some French roast on Sunday dinner. These little bundles were browned in a pan and sometimes finished in gravy, soaking up every bit of flavor like they had been waiting all day for it. The texture was soft, the taste was rich, and the presentation, well, that part made you feel like you were dining at a place that had real cloth napkins. They were a perfect disguise for humble ingredients. And just when you think the American kitchen could not get more inventive, along came a dish that turned ground beef into a noodle-topped flavor bomb with a crunchy surprise. The lost trick of dry stone soup is one of the most breathtaking examples of cooking ingenuity hidden in history. In times when pots were scarce or broken, native chefs would still find ways to create nourishing, flavorful stews using nothing but fire-heated rocks and hand-picked herbs. Clean, flat stones were heated in a roaring fire until they almost glowed, then carefully transferred into woven bark baskets or hide-lined pits filled with water and raw ingredients. As the stones boiled the water, fresh roots, wild greens, dried meats, and foraged herbs were added, cooking into rich, smoky broths that filled the air with the scent of earth and flame. The rocks would be swapped out as they cooled, replaced again and again with fresh hot ones, keeping the liquid at a steady simmer. And when it came to sweet treats for the journey ahead, native chefs had one more marvel: crafting rich, chewy fruit leather with nothing but sunlight, fresh air, and the simplest tools imaginable. Ground beef and turnip hash was born in farmhouse kitchens, where turnips were as plentiful as potatoes and just as important. When meat was scarce, women would dice the turnips fine, brown them with onions, and stir in a bit of ground beef for flavor. The turnips softened but kept a slight bite, their peppery taste blending beautifully with the savory meat. Everything cooked together in a skillet until golden and fragrant. It was the taste of thrift, of stretching what the land gave until it lasted through winter. Served hot with a fried egg or a slice of bread, it was a meal that required little but gave plenty. Farmers came in from the fields to eat it, grateful for its warmth and weight. It was not fancy, but it carried the flavor of resilience, the reminder that the simplest foods are often the most honest. Ground beef and cornmeal dumplings were a true lifesaver when money was tight, but stomachs were growling. The beef was browned up and simmered slow with a few onions and maybe a pinch of pepper. Then it was topped with dollops of cornmeal dough. When it steamed and cooked right over the beefy juices, the dumplings puffed up soft and tender, soaking up every bit of that rich, savory flavor. No one was counting calories back then. They were counting smiles around the dinner table, and these dumplings guaranteed a few extra ones. It was a dish that filled you up from the inside out, the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs in the best way possible. Even better, you could stretch a pound of beef to feed 6 or 7 people easy, which meant there was always enough for unexpected guests or seconds. If you thought that was the peak of stretching flavor and comfort, just wait until you hear about a casserole that captured everything good about ground beef and corn and wrapped it up in pure 1970s nostalgia. Cooking beef with bread crust lids was another way to make a small amount of meat feel like a full casserole. Grandma would line the top of a dish with old bread crusts, letting them bake until crispy and golden over the beef below. The bread absorbed juices as it baked, creating a savory topping that was both thrifty and delicious. It added texture and bulk, making the dish more satisfying without requiring extra meat. This clever use of stale bread meant nothing went to waste, and every meal looked like a complete dish. Families loved breaking through the crunchy topping to reach the beef underneath, turning dinner into a small event. It was resourcefulness presented in a way that felt indulgent. Today, we rely on breadcrumbs or cheese for toppings, but this old trick carried its own charm. It transformed scraps into something both practical and memorable, the kind of cleverness that defined Grandma's kitchen. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes was the kind of meal that made you feel like you were sitting in a booth at a roadside diner, even if you were just in your pajamas at the kitchen table. This was pure 1950s and 1960s comfort food, humble, hearty, and wonderfully filling. You started by browning ground beef with onions until it was sizzling and fragrant, then stirred in flour and beef broth to create a thick, savory gravy that clung to every bite. Some folks added a splash of milk or a pat of butter for extra richness. Either way, it worked. This dish was cheap, easy, and practically guaranteed to silence a hungry family. It was also endlessly adaptable: peas, corn, even a fried egg on top if you were feeling bold. This was a meal that made leftovers feel like a blessing. And just when you think ground beef could not get more cozy, the next recipe brings in a ring of flaky biscuits and a dose of party-time charm straight from your grandmother's cookbook shelf. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. Beef and vegetable. Kitchen sink stew was exactly what its name promised. Everything but the kitchen sink. It began with ground beef or scraps of leftover roast, followed by whatever vegetables still lingered in the root cellar: carrots, parsnips, turnips, onions, or even cabbage. The pot simmered slowly, the broth growing darker and richer as hours passed. No two batches ever tasted the same because no two kitchens had the same ingredients. It was the definition of resourcefulness, a stew built from odds and ends that might have otherwise gone to waste. Sometimes barley was added to thicken it, or a splash of vinegar to sharpen the flavor. It was a meal of invention, of pride in using every scrap. When families gathered around that steaming pot, they were not just eating, they were honoring the art of survival made delicious. The stew could feed a family for days, each reheating, deepening its flavor. It was never fancy, but it was deeply personal, a record of what the week had been and what was left to carry forward. Every spoonful told a quiet story of thrift, care, and endurance, reminding those who ate it that home was not measured by plenty, but by how you made do with what you had. Ground beef and heirloom. Bean chili was not just a dinner, it was a memory in a bowl. Picture a heavy pot hanging over a campfire filled with ground beef simmering alongside a rainbow of heirloom beans. Pinto beans, black beans, cranberry beans, all the ones your grandmother insisted were better than anything from a can. The beef gave it depth, the beans gave it body, and a handful of crushed wild herbs gave it a smoky aroma that floated through the night air. It was not the tongue-searing chili you find at competitions today either. This was smooth, mellow, and rich, made to be eaten with big hunks of bread or scooped right out of the pot with a wooden spoon. After a long day of work or a night under the stars, nothing tasted better. If you were lucky, there was always a second pot heating up for breakfast too, because good chili was not something you left behind. Now, if you thought a pot of campfire chili could make a night unforgettable, just wait until you see how a little cedar smoke could turn plain beef into backyard magic. Mixing in oats instead of breadcrumbs was one of Grandma's thriftiest and most reliable tricks, and it worked better than most of us realize. Rolled oats blended right into ground beef without taking away from its flavor, and because they absorbed juices, the beef stayed moist instead of drying out. Oats also gave meatloaf and patties a lighter texture that felt more filling, which mattered when you were trying to stretch a single pound to feed an entire table. For families who grew up in leaner times, this clever substitution was about more than thrift. It was about making meals last. Oats were affordable, always in the pantry, and easy to work with, which made them the perfect stand-in when breadcrumbs weren't available. The beauty of this trick is how seamlessly it fit into daily cooking. Most people couldn't even tell oats were hidden inside. Today, it's often overlooked because modern recipes default to breadcrumbs. But in truth, oats gave those classic dishes their old-fashioned heartiness. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about getting the most out of what you had and never letting an ingredient go to waste, which was the very spirit of Grandma's kitchen. Hungarian hamburger bake brought a little old-world flair to the weeknight dinner table. This casserole took seasoned ground beef and paired it with wide egg noodles, paprika, sour cream, and cheese. You would layer everything into a baking dish, then bake it until the noodles were tender and the sauce was bubbling and golden on top. It was creamy, smoky, and deeply satisfying. The paprika added warmth without being too spicy, and the sour cream gave it that signature tangy richness. It was not exactly authentic Hungarian cuisine, but it borrowed enough to make you feel like you were eating something a little exotic. The recipe was especially popular in Midwestern kitchens, where Eastern European immigrant traditions were still alive and well. It was the kind of dish that made you feel cultured without straying too far from your comfort zone. Most of the ingredients came from cans, boxes, or the fridge, nothing fancy or hard to find, and that was the whole point. Campfire foil packets were one part meal and one part memory. If you ever went to a summer scout camp or had a backyard cookout in the 1960s or 1970s, chances are you have made one of these. It started with a square of foil and a sense of adventure. You piled on raw ground beef, thin sliced potatoes, carrot coins, and slivers of onion. A little salt, a little pepper, maybe some garlic powder or ketchup if you were living fancy. Then you folded it all up, sealed it tight, and tossed it into the coals, or the oven if you were indoors. What came out 20 or 30 minutes later was something far greater than the sum of its parts. Some families added Worcestershire sauce or a pat of butter before sealing it. Others just kept it simple. But either way, it was delicious. It was also fun. There was something magical about unwrapping your own little packet and digging in with a fork. But if you wanted your beef with a bit more spice and southern flair, the next dish brought jambalaya right into casserole territory. Honey-glazed beef and roasted acorn medley was the kind of dinner that made you feel like you were living in the richest cabin on the mountain. Ground beef was browned until tender, glazed with a quick mix of wild honey and a splash of vinegar, then spooned over thick wedges of roasted acorn squash. The squash would caramelize around the edges, turning sweet and nutty, soaking up all those beefy, sticky drippings. Every forkful was this perfect mix of sweet, savory, and just a hint of tang, like nature itself was showing off. It was a harvest festival on a plate. No fancy ingredients needed, just a good hot oven and a little bit of patience. And if you thought honey and squash could make magic happen, just wait until you hear how ground beef and dried apples got folded into fry bread pockets tough enough to survive the Dust Bowl, but sweet enough to taste like hope itself. Braised cabbage with beef drippings was simplicity at its purest. In homes where every drop of fat was saved, nothing went to waste, not even the drippings left behind after browning beef. Those drippings were poured into a pan of cabbage and onions, simmered until tender and glistening. The cabbage absorbed every bit of savory richness, turning from plain to deeply flavorful. It was a dish that looked like almost nothing but tasted like something grand. Paired with bread or potatoes, it could stand as a meal on its own. The flavor was smoky, salty, and comforting. Proof that flavor did not come from abundance, but from care. Families who grew up on it still remembered the smell, the sizzle, the sweetness, the quiet satisfaction of making the most out of little. Sometimes the drippings were mixed with a splash of vinegar or a spoonful of sugar to balance the flavors, creating a depth that tasted almost luxurious. This was cooking without waste, a form of love written in grease-stained aprons and well-worn pans. It taught generations that good food did not depend on what you had, but on how you treated it. Cooking over aromatic wood like cedar was not just about building a fire. It was about infusing every meal with a living, breathing memory of the forest. Cedar, mesquite, alder, and hickory were prized not only for their heat, but for their ability to lend food an unmistakable perfume. Smoky, sweet, slightly bitter, and deeply grounding. Native chefs knew exactly which woods would turn a plain cut of fish or meat into something unforgettable. Fresh salmon might be roasted low over cedar planks, absorbing the wood's oils and scent, while rich game meats might get a kiss of mesquite's sharper bite. These woods were more than fuel. They were ingredients, carefully chosen like spices. And when it came to protecting meats from drying out or burning, native chefs did not just stop at wood. They found a way to wrap their food in the earth itself, locking in flavor with a method so smart it almost feels magical. Midwest meat. Pie was not a shepherd's pie. It was not a pot pie either. This dish stood proudly on its own, wrapped in flaky pastry and packed with flavor that hit like a warm embrace. Ground beef was the star, sautéed with onions, garlic, and sometimes carrots or peas, then thickened with beef broth or gravy until it reached that perfect spoon-coating consistency. All of that got tucked into a homemade, or store-bought, we won't tell, pie crust and sealed shut like a delicious little secret. Once baked, the crust turned golden and buttery, and the filling stayed rich, savory, and steaming hot. It was a meal that stuck with you, perfect for cold nights, family gatherings, or just when you wanted to feel like you were eating something special. But for a truly nostalgic flavor bomb that needed only a skillet and a squirt bottle, the next recipe made weeknights a lot more exciting and a little sweeter too. Beef and apple casserole sounds strange until you try it. It mixed brown beef with tart apples and onions, then baked it all in a mild broth or tomato sauce. The apples softened, turned sweet, and played off the savory beef in a way that felt surprising and familiar. It was not a dessert, not quite a stew. Somewhere in between, like pork chops and applesauce, but humbler. Some versions had breadcrumbs or mashed potatoes on top. Others stayed plain, served with toast. It was one of those oddball casserole ideas that only made sense in the 1960s. And many people made it again. The apples deepened the beef, the onions tied it all together. Sweet, savory, soft, and strange, but it worked. And for the people who made it back then, the taste never really left. Simmering beef in canned veggie juice was one of those clever ways to get both flavor and sauce in one step. A can of V8 or plain tomato juice could transform ground beef into a dish that was tangy, savory, and hearty all at once. The juice added moisture, preventing the beef from drying out, while also coating it in a sauce that could be poured over rice, noodles, or bread. This trick was both economical and efficient, using a single ingredient to do the work of several. Families benefited from the added vegetables in the juice, even if they didn't notice, which made it feel healthier too. The flavor was bold, different from plain tomato sauce, and it made dishes stand out from everyday fare. It was resourcefulness wrapped in simplicity, another reminder of how one clever substitution could create something memorable. Today, this hack feels forgotten, but it once carried a sense of ingenuity that families relied on to make meals special. Stretching with mashed potatoes was another clever way Grandma turned a little beef into a lot of dinner. Whenever there were leftovers sitting in the fridge, she didn't let them go unused. Instead, she folded the mashed potatoes directly into ground beef. The result was a creamy, hearty mixture that could be shaped into patties, baked into casseroles, or fried into crisp cakes that still tasted rich and filling. Potatoes not only extended the beef, but also added a silky texture that breadcrumbs or flour couldn't match. It was comfort food through and through, with a flavor that spoke to both frugality and warmth. Families who grew up on potato-stretched beef never forgot the way it felt to eat something so satisfying, even when times were lean. This wasn't a compromise. It was a form of creativity that made each bite taste more substantial. Instead of thinking about what was missing, you thought about how clever the dish was, how it filled the belly, and how Grandma always seemed to know how to make just enough food for everyone. These days, we often discard leftovers or reach for more meat, but the potato trick proves a pound could go further than you thought. Cheeseburger macaroni loaf sounds like something out of a box, and it kind of was. This dinner came from a time when boxed pasta meals and processed cheese were part of every pantry, and ground beef was the weekly star. You would cook macaroni, mix it with browned beef and a block of soft cheese, then pack the whole thing into a greased loaf pan. After baking, you sliced it like meatloaf. What came out looked strange, but tasted like a cross between a diner burger and weeknight casserole. It held its shape well enough to pack in a lunchbox or reheat in a skillet with a little butter. Some families added ketchup or mustard to the mix, giving it an even more literal burger flavor. Others tossed in pickles or onions for texture. It was easy, filling, and did not require much more than a pot, a pan, and a little patience. Cheeseburger macaroni loaf was one of those meals that tasted better than it had any right to. It was not elegant, It was not even normal. But in the era of efficiency and post-war pride, it was exactly what a busy household needed. A whole loaf of dinner made to slice and share. Beef macaroni loaf was what happened when mid-century homemakers got bored of plain old meatloaf and decided to shake things up, just a little. At first glance, it looked like the usual mix of ground beef, breadcrumbs, and seasoning. But inside, hiding like a delicious surprise, was elbow macaroni, cooked just shy of tender and folded right into the mix. Some versions even swapped out breadcrumbs entirely and used the pasta as the binder. Then came the tomato soup, poured in for moisture, color, and that unmistakable tangy sweet kick that Campbell's fans know all too well. The result was dense, hearty, and oddly elegant, like meatloaf had finally grown up and gotten a little flair. And because macaroni stretched the meat further, it was perfect for feeding bigger families on a budget. But for folks who wanted a more southern touch, the next dish took cornbread to places it had never gone before. The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Ground beef and potato hash was the week's final meal. Everything left over fried together until golden and good. Cold potatoes were diced, onions chopped, and ground beef stirred in, sizzling in bacon grease until the edges crisped. The sound alone could make a kitchen feel alive again. It was working people's food, simple and sustaining. The kind of meal that made no apologies for being plain because it did not have to. Served hot from cast iron, it was eaten with ketchup, pickles, or whatever condiment the cupboard still had. In some homes, an egg might crown the top, a small luxury that made it feel like something more. Families called it hash, but it was really a story of thrift, of making beauty from what remained. Every bite carried the smoky taste of labor and care, the warmth of food cooked slow and shared fast. Crispy corn cakes. Stuffed with seasoned beef were one of those foods you could smell cooking before you even stepped into the event. Little golden discs sizzling in big iron skillets, stuffed to the brim with ground beef seasoned with paprika, onions, and a pinch of chili powder if you wanted to wake up your taste buds. The outside was crunchy and golden, the inside savory and juicy. It was a dance of textures that made you keep reaching for just one more. The trick was to keep the corn cakes thin enough that they crisped up, but thick enough to hold all that seasoned beef inside without falling apart. At powwows and fairs, you would see kids running around with one in each hand, faces smeared with beefy goodness, while the elders sat back and nodded approvingly. It was simple, it was satisfying, and it was the perfect food for big gatherings where nobody had time for forks and knives. And if you think crispy stuffed corn cakes sound irresistible, wait until you pull up a camp chair and hear about the kind of chili that made starry nights and crackling fires taste even better. Using rice as a filler was one of the oldest and most dependable tricks for making ground beef go further. Grandma could take a single pound of beef and, with the addition of rice, stretch it into a whole pot of hearty food that filled every plate. Sometimes she used cooked rice, folding it in to bulk up casseroles and stews, while other times she used raw rice, letting it absorb juices as it cooked right alongside the beef. This was how porcupine meatballs became a household favorite. fluffy grains poking out from tender beef in a tomato-based sauce. It wasn't just about thrift, though. Rice added body, absorbed flavors beautifully, and made each bite feel substantial. In times when budgets were tight, this clever trick allowed families to keep eating beef dishes without breaking the bank. It was practical, resourceful, and tasted so good that no one felt they were missing out. Even now, the combination of beef and rice has a homey, comforting feel to it, reminding us of tables where nothing was wasted and meals always seemed to stretch just far enough to feed everyone gathered. Hamburger spoon bread bake was a southern trick that turned two humble meals into one. You seasoned ground beef, poured cornbread batter over it, and baked it until it puffed and browned. The meat stayed juicy, the cornbread caught the drippings, and every bite was soft and satisfying. You served it with a spoon, never sliced. That was the charm. It was food for people who had worked all day and just wanted something warm. It was often made with leftover cornbread or box mix, paired with beef fried with onions and maybe some paprika or chili powder. Cheese? Sometimes. Vegetables? If they were around. It depended on what was in the pantry and who was coming over. Spoon bread bake was loved in small towns where casseroles mattered, and feeding more people with less was a way of life. It might not look like much, but it was as filling as a second helping of love. Beef and biscuit ring was the edible version of a kitchen handshake, simple ingredients coming together in a way that felt a little bit fancy. This one was big in the 1950s and 1960s, the kind of dish you made when company was coming over and you wanted something pretty on the table. You would brown up a skillet of ground beef with onions, season it well, and stir in tomato sauce or Worcestershire for a saucy bite. Then came the biscuits, either homemade or straight from a can, no judgment here. You arranged them in a circle on a baking sheet or dish, spooned the beef mixture into the center, and baked until the biscuits puffed up golden and the beef was bubbling away like it had somewhere to be. It was a hit at parties and potlucks alike, and if there was cheese melted on top, forget about it. Plates were wiped clean. But if you really wanted to feel like you were dining at a steakhouse on a hamburger budget, the next dish took things up a notch. Ash baking was one of the most brilliant and humbling ways Native American cooks created bread without any tools, fancy ovens, or even a proper surface. When you needed to eat, you did not wait for the perfect setup. You dug into the earth itself. Dough was shaped into rough rounds and placed directly onto a bed of hot ashes and embers, then gently covered with more hot ash. The bread would cook slowly, surrounded by a blanket of heat, becoming crusty on the outside and pillowy soft on the inside. If a little ash clung to it, so be it. You brushed it off and bit into a smoky, earthy flavor that modern kitchens would pay fortunes to recreate. It was cooking stripped down to its raw, purest form, food born right from fire and earth. Today, ash-baked bread might seem primitive, but taste one bite of it, and you will understand exactly why this method lasted for centuries. And if you thought bread from ash was wild, wait until you hear how native chefs used cactus to transform even the toughest, most stubborn pieces of meat into buttery, tender feasts. Ground beef and oat loaf was the Depression's answer to meatloaf on a budget. When breadcrumbs were too dear, rolled oats stepped in, binding the meat and stretching it twice as far. Mixed with egg, onion, and a thin smear of tomato, it baked into a dense, hearty loaf that filled the kitchen with warmth. Each slice was firm and chewy, rich with the taste of hard work and determination. Served with mashed potatoes or a spoon of gravy, it gave families a sense of dignity. Real food, real effort, no waste. It was a meal of quiet pride, the kind that reminded people they could make do and still make something good. Even cold the next day, it tasted like comfort, its edges slightly sweet from the caramelized glaze. In every crumb was the story of making a little go a long way, and doing it with grace. Sage-infused ground beef patties might sound like something you would find in a fancy restaurant today, but back then, it was just another stroke of pure homegrown genius. Sage was everywhere in the right parts of the country, and it did not cost a dime to pick some fresh sprigs. Mixed into ground beef with a little salt and a whole lot of care, the result was a smoky, savory patty that smelled so good cooking, you would swear it could make a grown man cry. Fried up in an old cast iron pan until the edges were crispy and the middle stayed juicy, these patties were tossed onto plates with a scoop of beans, maybe some fried potatoes if you were lucky. They were not just filling, they were soul-satisfying. And once you tasted beef lifted up by wild sage, you would wonder why anyone ever bothered with plain salt and pepper again. Speaking of dishes that hit you right in the comfort zone, the next one was a staple at tables that needed stretching a meal just a little bit farther. Making a gravy base from beef drippings was one of the most practical and delicious habits Grandma swore by. After frying ground beef, she never just poured off the pan juices, they were too valuable to waste. Instead, she whisked in flour, maybe a splash of broth or milk, and built a flavorful gravy that could be ladled over mashed potatoes, bread, or noodles. This simple act turned a basic skillet of beef into a complete, comforting meal that stretched to feed more mouths. It gave dinners depth and warmth, making even small portions feel satisfying. Families relied on this trick not only because it saved money, but because it created flavor from what others might have discarded. The aroma of that sizzling gravy filled kitchens and promised a meal that was both hearty and resourceful. These days, we're often told to drain and discard fat for health reasons, but back then, every drop was an opportunity. That was the beauty of Grandma's cooking, knowing how to turn scraps into something rich, flavorful, and worth remembering long after the plates were cleared. Shipwreck stew looked like a mess, which was the idea. It was all layered into one pot: ground beef, potatoes, rice, canned soup, and maybe a few carrots. No stirring. Just stack it and let it simmer. The name came from how it looked, but the flavor was comforting. It was hearty, tangy, and always filling. This was survival food, emotional or otherwise. No fancy steps. The soup worked as sauce and seasoning. The starches made the beef stretch. It fed a whole family and left some for tomorrow. There was beauty in the chaos. Each family had their version, passed down in notes and memory. Some added beans, others swapped pasta for rice, but all of them made it work. Shipwreck stew meant one thing: making do. And maybe that is why it felt so good. It filled the plate, the belly, and sometimes the quiet. Shipwreck casserole had a name that made you curious and a flavor that made you stay. No one really knows where the name came from. Some say it is because it used whatever ingredients survived in the pantry. Others say it is just what happened to your kitchen when you made it. But if you were growing up in the 1960s or 1970s, you probably saw this show up on your plate more than once. Ground beef was the anchor, and from there, things got creative. Potatoes, sliced thin or cubed chunky, laid the foundation. Rice, usually the minute kind, came in next. Then canned tomatoes, the workhorse of every budget-friendly meal, tied it all together in a bubbling, slightly tangy mix that somehow always hit the spot. And if you think that is resourceful, wait until you see what happened when people tried to make steak rolls without the steak. Acorn meal might not sound glamorous today, but to Native American cooks, it was a golden ticket to rich, sustaining nutrition. In a world where wheat and cornmeal were not always reliable, acorns from oak trees were gathered in huge numbers, then carefully leached to remove bitterness. The result was a fine, nutty flour that could be used to make breads, thick soups, or even hearty porridges. Acorn meal carried a deep, earthy taste that felt heavier and more nourishing than modern flour, and it was packed with oils and minerals that kept bodies strong through brutal winters and hard seasons. It was slow, careful work, but it paid off with food that could last for months. And unlike store-bought flour today, acorn meal reminded every bite of where it came from. But even when bread was needed quickly, native chefs had a trick up their sleeves, heating river stones until they became the perfect natural griddles for making flatbreads on the fly. Cabbage and apple skillet was the unexpected pairing that somehow made perfect sense. Sliced apples softened alongside shreds of cabbage in a cast-iron pan, their sweetness blending with a touch of vinegar and the salt of whatever meat was available, often bacon ends or bits of beef. The result was a balance of tart and savory, sweet and smoky. It filled the home with a smell both sharp and comforting, like the promise of something good on a lean day. This dish belonged to families who used what they had, turning orchard fruit and garden cabbage into something memorable. Served alongside bread or potatoes, it brought a little color and cheer to the gray months of winter. Cabbage and apple skillet was not just food. It was proof that frugality could still taste like care, and that even hardship had room for warmth. When it comes to the kind of food that could bring a whole community together, nothing beats a powwow taco skillet. Picture this: golden fry bread sizzling in a cast iron skillet, layered with spiced ground beef, beans, and a sprinkle of sharp cheddar. It is hearty, it is filling, and it is the kind of thing you could smell from half a mile away at a summer fairground. The best part was how everyone had their own little twist. Some would add green chilies, others would pile on diced tomatoes and shredded lettuce. No matter how you stacked it, it was one of those meals where you needed both hands and a whole lot of napkins. It was a festival favorite that always found its way back to the dinner table at home, whether or not there was a real powwow happening. Trust me, once you tried it, no ordinary taco could ever compete. But if you thought the skillet was the ultimate party trick, wait until you see what folks were flipping onto backyard grills during family gatherings. Ground beef shepherd's pie, American style, was the taste of comfort layered in a dish. Beneath the golden crust of mashed potatoes lay a hearty filling of ground beef, cabbage, onions, and vegetables, the kind of mixture that could feed a crowd for little cost. The top browned beautifully, the edges crisping while the inside stayed creamy and soft. Each serving felt like home, rich and warm enough to thaw the coldest evening. It was the kind of dish passed from stove to table without fuss, eaten by families who had earned their meal one long day at a time. The smell alone was enough to draw everyone in, savory, buttery, and full of promise. American shepherd's pie was not born of wealth, but of wisdom. Make what you have, make it last, and make it good. Families would often top it with whatever mash was available, potatoes, turnips, or a mix of both, making every version unique. It was a dish that proved comfort could be built from layers of patience and practicality, turning hardship into something that felt like abundance. Hearty ground beef and flint corn shepherd's pie was not just a dish, it was a statement. Ground beef seasoned with onions, garlic, and wild herbs formed the base, but the real star was the topping, a mash made from flint cornmeal instead of regular old potatoes. Flint corn, the rugged ancestor of sweet corn, had this deep, nutty flavor that took the whole pie to another level. It was a tough crop that thrived when nothing else would, which made it the perfect partner for a meal built to last. The top baked into a golden crust, just thick enough to crack when you spooned into it, revealing the juicy beef and rich gravy underneath. It was a shepherd's pie made for real shepherds. Sturdy, filling, and full of heart. And if you thought that was the peak of comfort food innovation, just wait until you hear about the fritters that brought sweet potatoes and beef together in a state fair dream you could actually carry in your hand. Making fruit leather with nothing but the sun and a flat rock was the perfect way to capture summer's sweetness for the long, hungry months ahead. Native American cooks would mash wild berries, apples, or plums into thick, pulpy pastes and spread them carefully over flat, sun-warmed stones. Covered lightly with woven grasses or bark to keep pests away, the fruit would dry slowly under the open sky, concentrating into chewy, intensely flavored strips packed with vitamins and natural sugars. These homemade fruit leathers were not just snacks. They were essential travel rations, dessert after lean meals, and precious gifts given between families and tribes. And while these sweet creations came from the land's generosity, another treasure was pulled from its hidden places too, one that changed cooking, trade, and survival forever: the gathering of salt from natural licks deep in the wild. Egg and beef bake, also known by some as breakfast surprise, was the kind of dish that turned a simple Sunday morning into something worth writing home about. Popular at church brunches and potluck tables throughout the 1960s and 1970s, this casserole was a hidden gem in the world of ground beef cooking. It started with scrambled eggs, sometimes real, sometimes powdered, depending on the budget, mixed with seasoned ground beef, sautéed onions, and a generous helping of cheese. Some versions included potatoes, others stirred in day-old bread cubes to stretch the meal and soak up all the flavor. It was perfect for early risers, late sleepers, or anyone who believed breakfast should be more than just toast and coffee. And if that sounds like a surprising way to wake up, just wait until you see what happened when health food met comfort food in the 1970s garden patch. Beef and tomato aspic with vegetables was once considered elegant. Seriously. You started with unflavored gelatin, added beef broth or tomato juice, and poured it over cooked beef, celery, peas, and carrots. Then it chilled in the fridge until firm. Served cold and shaped in a decorative mold, this jiggly dish became the centerpiece of many retro dinner parties. It was savory jello, made not for sweetness, but for structure. The gelatin gave it shine, the beef gave it weight, the vegetables gave it texture, and the result was something you either liked or quietly skipped. Aspic ruled mid-century American cookbooks, especially for hosts wanting to impress. It was low-fat, high-protein, and oddly artistic. You would slice it thin and serve it with lemon or a dab of mayo. Today, it feels outdated. But for a generation raised on molded salads and chilled entrees, beef and tomato aspic was proof that even simple ingredients could be dressed up to impress. Folding in cooked barley was another clever trick that turned ground beef into something heartier without costing more. Barley was cheap, filling, and had a nutty flavor that paired perfectly with beef. Once cooked and added to the meat, it absorbed juices and spices, stretching the mixture into larger portions. Families didn't just get more food, they got a meal that felt satisfying and rustic, with a chewy texture that stood out from plain beef alone. This was especially common during hard times when making meat last was a necessity. The grain gave the illusion of abundance and made sure no one left the table hungry. Barley also brought a wholesome quality, adding nutrition while keeping costs low. Today, barley has mostly been forgotten in beef dishes, but its role in old kitchens was vital. It showed that the best fillers weren't bland. They actually added flavor and substance that made meals taste richer. Beef jambalaya bake took everything you loved about Louisiana comfort food and gave it a weeknight twist. Traditional jambalaya was made with shrimp or sausage, but when ground beef was what you had, you did not complain, you improvised. This casserole was warm, spicy, and overflowing with flavor. You would start by browning the beef in a skillet with onions, bell peppers, and celery, the Cajun holy trinity. Toss in some garlic, tomato paste, and a good shake of paprika or cayenne pepper, and suddenly, the whole house smelled like dinner was about to get exciting. Then came the rice, which cooked in the pan with beef broth or tomato juice until everything swelled and soaked up the seasoning. Some families added beans or corn. Others threw cheese on top and baked it for an extra kick. It was the kind of dish that got passed around the table fast and left nothing behind but crumbs. And if you think baking jambalaya was clever, just wait until you see what happens when you stuff a hamburger inside an onion. No bun required. Reservation-style beef jerky chili was one of those dishes that proved you could teach an old dog new tricks, or at least make an old recipe sing a whole new song. Instead of fresh beef, cooks would start with homemade beef jerky, the tough, dried strips getting rehydrated slowly in a bubbling pot of tomatoes, beans, and roasted peppers. The jerky gave the chili a smoky, chewy backbone that regular ground beef just could not match. A big cast-iron pot of jerky chili could feed a whole crew and then some, and there was never a spoon left clean afterward. If you think that sounds like the ultimate use for a handful of old jerky, just wait until you hear about the roasted maize enchiladas that made even the most ordinary dinner feel like a lost celebration worth remembering. Ground beef and hominy stew was a blend of necessity and creativity, especially in the American South and Midwest. Hominy, canned or dried corn kernels puffed by lime water, stood in for pasta or rice when neither could be spared. Mixed with ground beef, onions, and a few tomatoes or chili powder, it became a stew both hearty and humble. The texture was unique, chewy, thick, and full of warmth. It was filling enough to feed many mouths and simple enough to make on any night of the week. Some families called it poor man's chili, others just called it dinner. Served steaming with cornbread, it brought a kind of pride, the pride of making something from almost nothing and doing it well. Its scent was rich, earthy, and smoky, carrying through the house long before supper was called. Some cooks added beans for more bulk or diced peppers for flavor, while others relied only on what they could pull from the pantry. Every bowl was a reflection of ingenuity, proving that comfort could rise from even the humblest shelves. The stew was more than sustenance. It was survival seasoned with gratitude. The trick of smoking corn husks for deep, sweet flavor might sound simple today, but it was revolutionary in the world of ancient cooking. Corn was life to many native communities, not just a crop, but a living gift. Every part of it was precious, especially the husks. By soaking them lightly and laying them over hot coals or wrapping food inside them, cooks could infuse whatever they were making with a smoky, sweet richness that no wood or spice could ever truly replace. Smoking corn husks became a way to turn plain dishes into something sacred, layering that faint sweetness into meats, vegetables, even simple bread. It was an invisible ingredient, a secret handshake between the land and the plate. Today, a few high-end restaurants still use this trick, usually without telling you, because the result feels so natural, so impossibly rich, that diners are left wondering what kind of sorcery they have just eaten. But corn was not the only plant they turned to for hidden flavor and power. If you knew where to look, even the tallest pine trees offered a secret recipe for survival. Texas hash was not born in a diner or dreamed up by a chef. It came from necessity, flavor, and the magic of one-pan cooking. This dish was a lifesaver in kitchens during the 1960s and 1970s, especially when money was tight but taste still mattered. It started in a skillet, like most good things do. Ground beef hit the pan, followed by chopped onions and bell peppers. As everything sizzled and softened, in went the tomatoes, sometimes fresh, sometimes canned, and a scoop of cooked rice. Chili powder or a few dashes of hot sauce gave it a warm Tex-Mex flair without pushing into full-on heat. It was hearty, filling, and endlessly flexible. Some families added corn or black beans. No wonder it stayed in rotation for decades. But if Texas hash was the rebellious teen of ground beef meals, the next dish was pure whimsy, because what could possibly go wrong with meat and mashed potatoes shaped like a bird's nest? Tamale pie with cornmeal crust was the Southwest's answer to a casserole, and it had attitude. The bottom was a savory mix of ground beef, onions, garlic, and chili powder, often with canned tomatoes or beans tossed in for volume. That got spooned into a deep dish. Then came the real star, a thick layer of cheesy cornmeal batter, sometimes spiked with jalapenos or creamed corn, poured over the top and baked until golden. When it came out of the oven, the cornmeal topping had puffed slightly, absorbing just enough of the sauce below to stay moist but never soggy. It smelled like campfire nights and school lunch lines. Tamale pie was bold, spicy, and comforting all at once. It let home cooks experiment with heat and seasoning, especially when taco kits were still new and exciting. You did not need to know how to make tamales to enjoy the flavor. Just beef, cornmeal, and some courage. The recipe showed up in Western and Southwestern cookbooks and made its way across the country in the back pockets of families looking for something different. It was not traditional, but it did not need to be. Tamale pie was its own thing, and that was more than enough. Turning beef into breakfast hash was a clever way of making leftovers feel like a brand new meal. Instead of letting scraps of ground beef go unused, Grandma would crumble them into a skillet with diced potatoes and onions. Fried until golden and crispy, the mixture became a hearty breakfast that kept families full until lunch. This trick was about more than thrift. It was about variety, ensuring that yesterday's dinner didn't feel repetitive. Sometimes eggs were cracked on top or served alongside, making the dish even more satisfying. The sizzling smell of hash in the morning was the kind of aroma that filled kitchens with warmth and comfort. It showed that no ingredient was too small to be reinvented into something substantial. Today, we think of hash as diner food, but it was once a symbol of resourcefulness at home. It turned the act of using leftovers into an opportunity for something delicious and comforting. Hamburger gravy on cornbread was a Southern staple you rarely see anymore, but it never stopped being smart. You browned ground beef with onions and seasoned it. Salt, pepper, maybe garlic powder if it was handy, then added a bit of flour and milk to make a creamy gravy. Instead of pouring it over biscuits, you served it over a warm slice of cornbread. The result was hearty and slightly sweet, something that stuck to your ribs. In Appalachian regions, this was weekday fare. It used pantry ingredients, filled a plate fast, and tasted like home. Sometimes the cornbread came from a cast-iron skillet, other times from a mix. No one judged. The creaminess, the crumbly texture, the beef salt, and the corn's sweetness made it work. It was cheap, fast, and made you feel cared for. Not fancy, not modern, but still just right. Stuffed green pepper skillet was the answer to every busy home cook's prayers. Sure, stuffed peppers looked nice on the plate, but hollowing them out, blanching them, and carefully baking each one? That took time and energy many folks just did not have. This recipe solved the problem by tossing everything into one skillet. You started by browning ground beef with onions and garlic, then added chopped green peppers. Not hollowed, not roasted, just chopped and ready to go. Then came the rice, tomato sauce, and seasoning. Some folks spiced it up with paprika or Italian herbs. Others added a splash of beef broth to help everything simmer together. As it cooked, the peppers softened and the rice soaked up all the juices, turning it into a one-pan meal that was rich, hearty, and every bit as flavorful as the classic version. It was the kind of dish that never let a busy night win. But if you liked your skillet meals even saucier and a little more old school, the next dish was like a warm handshake from your grandmother's recipe box. Infusing oils with wild herbs long before it became trendy was second nature to native cooks who understood that flavor did not come from stores, but from the living world around them. Fresh herbs like sweetgrass, wild mint, sage, and juniper were gathered and carefully steeped in animal fats or pressed plant oils, allowing their potent essences to slowly bloom and transform the base oils into something extraordinary. These infused oils were drizzled over roasted meats, stirred into thick stews, rubbed onto flatbreads, or even used for medicinal purposes. Every bottle or pouch of herb-infused oil was a time capsule of the land's abundance, a way to capture fleeting seasons and extend their gifts into the colder, harder months. Even today, chefs trying to recreate authentic indigenous flavors find themselves returning to these ancient, pure methods. And while infusing oils with herbs might sound refined and elegant, Native American cooking was never about luxury. It was about survival, community, and turning every meal into a ceremony of thanks, a tradition that still whispers through the kitchens of those who have not forgotten. Smoky ground beef with wild mint and juniper berries might sound like something a fancy chef dreamed up, but long before it ever hit a white tablecloth, it was the food of survival and celebration. Ground beef was browned low and slow, then mixed with hand-picked wild mint leaves and crushed juniper berries, which gave it this cool, smoky bite that you could not fake with store-bought seasoning. The beef soaked up the woodsy flavors until every bite was like eating a piece of the forest itself. It was a dish that stuck with you, the kind of taste that did not just fill your belly, but rooted itself deep into your memory. Sometimes it was served with a simple flatbread, sometimes spooned over roasted squash or wild rice if you were lucky. If you think mint and juniper could breathe that much new life into a skillet of beef, wait until you see how good old-fashioned flint corn turned a humble shepherd's pie into a feast you would swear was touched by magic. Shaping beef into steaks was one of those clever illusions that made dinners feel fancier than they really were. With a bit of seasoning and careful shaping, Grandma could take plain ground beef and press it into oval patties that looked like individual cuts of steak. Once browned in a skillet and topped with gravy or onions, they gave the impression of a hearty, steakhouse-style meal without the cost of real steak. For families who couldn't often afford higher cuts of meat, this trick was a way to enjoy the feeling of indulgence without breaking the budget. Kids grew up thinking they were eating something special, and in a way, they were. The special part was how much love and creativity went into making dinner stretch. The technique wasn't complicated, but it carried a sense of pride in serving meals that looked more extravagant than they were. Today we call it Salisbury steak or hamburger steak, but the heart of it is the same, turning ground beef into something greater than the sum of its parts. It was resourcefulness wrapped in flavor, and it left memories stronger than the meat itself. Salisbury steak casserole was the homemade version of a frozen food legend. Instead of pulling a silver tray from the oven, families made their own from scratch, and honestly, it was usually better. This version called for seasoned ground beef shaped into thick oval patties, then baked in a mushroom and onion gravy. It was rich, saucy, and had that stick-to-your-ribs kind of feel. If you were lucky, someone would sprinkle crispy fried onions on top during the last few minutes in the oven, adding that perfect crunch to an already comforting dish. It was not a fancy meal, but it felt like something special. Some people added Worcestershire sauce or a splash of soy for extra umami, but most just used canned soup and a good hand with salt and pepper. You would serve it with mashed potatoes, egg noodles, or a slice of white bread to sop up all that gravy. Kids loved it because it tasted like fast food. Adults loved it because it was hearty and cheap. Ground beef fondue balls were the kind of appetizer that made cocktail parties in the 1950s and 1960s feel just a little more exciting. Long before charcuterie boards and sliders took over the scene, these little beef bites ruled the hors d'oeuvre table. The base was simple: seasoned ground beef mixed with cooked rice or shredded cheese, rolled into balls, and sometimes even wrapped around a cube of cheddar. Then came the fun part. You either baked them until crispy or fried them golden brown, and served them with a side of bubbling fondue. Cheese, tomato, or mustard-based dips were all fair game. They were easy to make ahead, easy to freeze, and easy to eat, which made them perfect for house parties, church socials, and anything that required a plate of finger food with a little flair. They may have started as a budget-friendly snack, but they were anything but boring. And if your idea of fun is a skillet full of beef, rice, and Tex-Mex spices, then the next recipe is a spicy slice of vintage perfection. How native chefs made instant trail mix with dried berries and nuts is a perfect example of simple genius meeting real-world survival. Long before colorful packages lined grocery store shelves, Native American communities were gathering handfuls of nature's purest energy foods, drying them carefully under the sun, and combining them into powerful portable meals. Wild berries like chokecherry, elderberry, and wild strawberries were prized for their tartness and nutrition, while nuts like acorns, walnuts, and pine nuts packed a heavy punch of fat and protein. Some tribes even added roasted seeds, puffed grains, or strips of dried meat for extra stamina. The goal was not just taste, but endurance. It was survival in your pocket, designed by thousands of years of knowledge. And while they packed sweetness and strength into every bite, when it came to seasoning savory meals, native chefs turned to another source altogether: wild plants that turned every piece of meat into pure wilderness flavor. Crispy fried beef and root vegetable pockets were not just dinner, they were survival disguised as a treat. Picture dough rolled thin, packed full of seasoned ground beef, diced carrots, sweet potatoes, and turnips, then folded tight and fried until golden and flaky. It was like the first generation of the hand pies everyone brags about today, only made from scratch, with love and whatever you had left in the root cellar. These little pockets were the ultimate grab-and-go meal before drive-thrus were even a thing. They stayed warm wrapped in cloth, perfect for long days in the fields or a chilly walk to the town market. Every bite was crispy outside, juicy and tender inside, with the sweet earthiness of the root veggies soaking up all the beefy flavor. Families would make dozens at a time and stash them away for later, if they managed to last that long. Now, if you think stuffing beef and veggies into a crispy golden package sounds brilliant, wait until you hear about the Sunday classic that brought sage, beef, and cornbread together into something that tasted a whole lot like home. Cabbage and milk stew was the quiet staple of dairy country, born from necessity and ingenuity. In regions where milk was easier to come by than stock, women used it to build a creamy base for cabbage and bits of ground beef. The milk thickened as it simmered, wrapping the vegetables in a gentle, velvety sauce. The result was mild, nourishing, and surprisingly rich, comfort made from simplicity. Some added a pinch of nutmeg or pepper to balance the sweetness. Others stirred in leftover potatoes to make it thicker. It was not glamorous food, but it was deeply human. The kind of meal you ate slowly with gratitude. The aroma of warm milk and cabbage filled the kitchen with quiet calm. In every spoonful was the story of families who made do, who turned scarcity into something beautiful through patience and heart. Even after mealtime ended, the smell lingered, clinging to aprons and windowsills, reminding everyone that love could be measured in simmering pots. It was a meal that restored more than hunger. It restored peace. Layering beef under mashed potatoes was one of those comforting tricks that turned scraps into something special. If there were bits of ground beef left from dinner, Grandma didn't discard them. She layered them into a dish and covered them with fluffy mashed potatoes. Baked in the oven, it transformed into a hearty shepherd's pie that felt like a whole new meal. This trick gave leftovers a second life, while also ensuring that no one left the table hungry. The contrast between the savory beef and creamy potatoes made it a family favorite, even if it began as scraps. For kids, it was simply delicious, while for adults, it was a clever way of making sure the budget stretched further. It showed how resourcefulness could create comfort food that felt intentional and warm. Today, shepherd's pie is still enjoyed, but its origins as a thrifty leftover dish are often forgotten. Back then, it wasn't about style or trend, it was about making the most out of what you had. That practical mindset turned simple ingredients into meals that carried meaning, and that's why dishes like these linger in memory long after they leave the table. Hamburger eggplant casserole was a post-war invention that came straight out of backyard gardens and budget-conscious kitchens. People grew eggplant because it was hearty, easy to harvest, and filled out a meal when meat was in short supply. The dish started with sliced, salted eggplant that was briefly fried or baked, then layered with cooked ground beef, tomato sauce, and breadcrumbs. Sometimes there was cheese, sometimes not. It all depended on what you had. The flavors were simple but filling: rich tomato, soft eggplant, and the unmistakable heartiness of seasoned ground beef. You baked it until it bubbled and browned on top, and by the time it hit the table, it looked like a home-cooked lasagna without any of the fuss. This was food you made when you had too many eggplants and not enough time. It was healthy by accident and thrifty by design. You could serve it as a main course or stretch it with a side of white rice. Either way, it felt like a proper meal. Hamburger eggplant casserole may not have survived the decades in style, but it never failed where it counted: in taste, texture, and the comfort of something hot at the end of the day. Old-school goulash, or as some knew it, American chop suey, was the dish that proved ground beef and elbow macaroni were soulmates. This one-pot wonder became a fixture on stovetops from Maine to Missouri. It started with browned beef, onions, and garlic, all bubbling away in a pot. Then came the crushed tomatoes or tomato sauce, which turned the mix into a deep red stew. Toss in a few handfuls of cooked macaroni, and suddenly you had dinner for 6, and maybe lunch tomorrow. What made goulash so special was not just the taste, though that was plenty satisfying. It was the simplicity. It was comfort food with no rules, and that made it a favorite in kitchens where imagination mattered more than a well-stocked pantry. Goulash was the dish that filled plates and hearts at the same time. But if you think that was creative, wait until you see what happened when someone took a bag of corn chips and turned it into dinner. The secret of grease preserves is one of those survival tricks that almost defies belief today. After cooking meat, Native American chefs would save every drop of rendered animal fat, pouring it carefully over shredded or chopped pieces of the meat inside clay pots or animal bladders. Once sealed, the fat hardened into a protective barrier that kept bacteria and air out, preserving the meat for weeks, even months. This was not just storage. It was insurance against famine, sickness, and scarcity. Meat preserved this way stayed rich, flavorful, and nutritious, providing vital energy when fresh food was impossible to find. Every time someone dipped into a pot of grease preserves, they were eating a lesson in patience, gratitude, and survival. But even the best preserved meat needed help lasting through long journeys or seasons, and sometimes the land itself offered the perfect cold pantry, hidden just beneath your feet. Cabbage and tomato rice soup was humble but radiant, its color alone enough to brighten a dim winter day. A pot of it simmered on many stoves through the 1930s and 1940s, its ingredients simple: cabbage, rice, tomatoes, and maybe a handful of ground beef if fortune allowed. The tomatoes gave it a tang that cut through the sweetness of the cabbage, while the rice thickened it just enough to feel like a meal. This soup had no waste, no excess, only nourishment. It filled homes with the scent of simmering comfort, proof that even the poorest kitchens could make something deeply satisfying. Served with crusts of bread or cornbread, it became more than soup. It became sustenance, flavored with gratitude and hope for better days. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar or sugar to balance the taste, a small touch that gave it life. It was a meal that warmed the body and soothed the soul, a reminder that contentment often came bubbling in the simplest of pots. Ground beef and roasted pumpkin stew was proof that simple ingredients could make meals fit for kings, or at least tired farmers at the end of a long day. Chunks of roasted pumpkin, sweet and caramelized around the edges, were simmered slow with seasoned ground beef, a splash of broth, and whatever herbs were growing out back. The pumpkin melted just enough to thicken the stew without turning it to mush, giving every bite a natural sweetness that played perfectly against the savory beef. Ladled into big bowls and eaten with hunks of bread or thick corn cakes, it was a harvest meal through and through. The best part was how it changed depending on what you had. Sometimes wild herbs, sometimes a handful of dried berries thrown in for a tangy surprise. It was all about using what the earth gave you and making something unforgettable with it. And if you think beef and pumpkin make a strong team, just wait until you taste smoky ground beef laced with the wild kiss of mint and juniper berries. Cooking with onion soup mix was one of those mid-century hacks that made its way into countless beef recipes, and for good reason. The packets were cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with onion flavor that instantly transformed ground beef. Grandma would sprinkle it into meatloaf, burgers, or casseroles, and suddenly the dish tasted like it had been seasoned all day. The dried onion flakes added texture, while the seasoning mix brought a savory depth that was hard to achieve with just salt and pepper. For busy households, it was a shortcut that never felt like cheating, because the results were always so satisfying. Families grew used to the rich flavor it gave their meals, and the convenience meant it became a pantry staple in many homes. Today, with so many seasoning blends on the shelves, onion soup mix feels almost quaint, but it was once revolutionary in its simplicity. It proved that with a single packet, a plain pound of beef could be turned into something memorable. This trick was less about being fancy and more about being clever, and that's exactly why it became one of Grandma's sworn-by secrets. Hot dog and ground beef skillet was not just a kid-friendly meal. It was dinner in a pinch. You sliced a few hot dogs, browned them with ground beef and chopped onions, then stirred in a can of tomatoes. Maybe some macaroni if you were feeling ambitious. Let it simmer until the sauce thickened. Kids loved the hot dogs. Adults liked that it filled everyone up. Some called it cowboy skillet. Others called it Tuesday. Either way, it stretched two meats into a full meal. No need for sides. Just a fork, a plate, and a few quiet minutes where everyone actually ate. These kinds of dishes showed up in older cookbooks, especially the kind you got free with a cereal box. They were not about impressing anyone, just making do. Maple sap water, the original sweet cooking liquid, was one of nature's purest gifts and one that Native American communities mastered long before the first colonists ever set foot in North America. In early spring, when the nights were still cold but the days warmed just enough, sap would begin to flow through the veins of maple trees. Native foragers would tap these trees carefully, gathering the clear, slightly sweet liquid that poured out. It was not yet the thick, sticky syrup we think of today. Instead, it was a crisp, refreshing, faintly sweet water that could be drunk straight or used to cook rice, stew, or even brew lightweight, revitalizing teas. To drink maple sap water was to drink hope after a brutal winter. But as delicious as maple was, native chefs had another dark, overlooked ingredient that added both flavor and unexpected health benefits to their meals. And it came straight from the heart of the fire itself. Southwest ground beef and prickly pear tostadas were the edible postcards of the desert. Colorful, a little prickly, and totally unforgettable. Ground beef was seasoned with smoky chilies, cumin, and a squeeze of fresh lime piled high onto crisp tostada shells and crowned with a tangy prickly pear salsa that brought the whole thing to life. If you have never had prickly pear before, it tastes like watermelon. And bubblegum had a baby, with just enough tartness to keep you on your toes. It cut through the rich, savory beef like a song you cannot get out of your head. This was the kind of dish that made people rethink what leftovers could do, stretching a little beef a long way while making it feel like a party on a plate. And if you think a little cactus fruit can transform a simple meal, just wait until you grab a tin cup and sit by the fire for a rugged ragu packed with pine nuts and campfire charm. Frying leftover meatloaf as sandwich filler was one of Grandma's most clever ways to reinvent yesterday's dinner. She would slice cold meatloaf straight from the fridge, drop it into a hot skillet, and crisp it until the edges sizzled golden while the inside warmed through. Once tucked between bread, sometimes plain, sometimes toasted, it transformed into a hearty sandwich that felt brand new. A swipe of ketchup, mustard, or even leftover gravy turned it into a meal strong enough to rival anything from a diner. This trick meant leftovers never felt repetitive, and kids often had no idea they were eating yesterday's dinner. The crispy edges against soft bread made every bite memorable, the kind of flavor that stuck with you. For lunchboxes, it was a treat disguised as thrift, and many still recall the taste decades later. It was resourcefulness wrapped in comfort, proof that creativity made nothing feel wasted. Today, leftovers often get tossed aside, but back then they were opportunities. Grandma's frying trick showed that with just a little imagination, food could shine twice. Roasting root vegetables directly in campfire coals was one of the simplest yet most powerful cooking methods passed down through generations. Without ovens, pots, or fancy tools, native cooks understood that the earth's hidden foods, things like carrots, turnips, onions, and yams, could be transformed into sweet, hearty meals with nothing more than time and fire. Raw roots were buried in the hot, glowing coals of a dying fire, slowly roasting under layers of ash and heat. As they baked, their natural sugars caramelized, their fibers softened, and what once was hard and bitter became soft, rich, and deeply satisfying. Pulling a roasted root from the coals was like uncovering buried treasure, the skin blackened and crisp, the inside steaming and tender. And speaking of patience, some of the sweetest flavors ever created by native chefs required even longer waits, like gathering and boiling maple sap into a clear, nourishing water that tasted like spring itself. Spiced beef and corn casserole with wild garlic butter was the kind of dish you could smell from the driveway, pulling you straight through the door like a cartoon character chasing a pie on a windowsill. Ground beef was cooked slow with a heavy sprinkle of cumin, paprika, and crushed red pepper, then layered thick with sweet corn kernels and baked into a bubbling golden dream. But the real secret weapon? Wild garlic butter. Made from foraged wild garlic or whatever scrappy greens you could get your hands on, it was melted right over the top before serving, sinking into every crack and corner. The butter softened the spice just enough to keep you going back for bite after bite, and it was not uncommon for folks to scrape the corners of the casserole dish clean with a crust of fry bread. And if you thought a little wild garlic could change the game like that, just wait until you wrap your hands around a stew so smoky and rich it practically dragged the 1980s back into your kitchen. Mock Swiss steak was a stovetop classic that delivered comfort without complication. Now, it had nothing to do with Switzerland, and it was not really steak either, But none of that mattered once the fork hit the plate. This dish was pure 1950s ingenuity, turning ground beef into a dinner that felt fancier than it had any right to be. The beef was shaped into thick oval patties, then dredged lightly in flour and browned until the edges crisped. But the real magic happened when the tomato and onion gravy hit the pan. Sweet, savory, and slow-simmered, that sauce softened the patties until they practically melted. Some folks added a bit of garlic, a pinch of oregano, or even a splash of vinegar to give it extra depth. Served over mashed potatoes or wide egg noodles, it was the kind of meal that made you sigh after the first bite. And just when you thought ground beef had done everything it could for dinner, it decided to show up at the breakfast table and brought the eggs and cheese along for the ride. Combining beef with lentils or beans was another trick that showed Grandma's genius for stretching protein. A handful of lentils or a can of beans mixed into ground beef doubled the volume and made meals heartier without doubling the cost. The legumes absorbed flavors beautifully, blending right into chilies, soups, or skillet meals. They also added nutrition, making dishes higher in fiber and protein while lowering the overall cost per serving. Families might not have even noticed they were eating less meat because the meals still tasted full and satisfying. This was a practical solution during times when money or rations were tight, but it was also a healthy one. The result was food that felt abundant, even when it wasn't extravagant. Today, the idea of mixing beans into beef is often promoted as modern, but it has deep roots in kitchens that already mastered the art of balance. For Grandma, it wasn't a trend, it was common sense. Every scoop of beans or lentils meant more mouths fed and fewer worries about running out. It was a lesson in how simplicity and ingenuity could create abundance out of scarcity. Ground beef and dried apple. Fry bread pockets were pure, stubborn survival tucked into golden handheld miracles. Ground beef seasoned with whatever was on hand, usually just salt, pepper, and maybe a little nutmeg if you had it, was folded into fry bread dough alongside chopped dried apples, then fried to a crisp, perfect finish. The apples would plump up inside the bread, their tart sweetness cutting through the savory beef like a memory of better days. These pockets were Dust Bowl food, meant to be portable, tough, and nourishing when nothing else was. If you think beef and dried apples sound strange together, just remember, when life gives you dust and sorrow, you bake something worth smiling over. And if you thought that was clever, wait until you hear about the casserole that paired beef, corn, and wild garlic butter in a way so good, it should have been framed and hung on the wall. Beef and cabbage. Hand pies were the perfect working man's lunch. Hearty, portable, and made entirely from leftovers. The dough was simple, a mix of flour, water, and lard rolled thin, then folded over a filling of minced beef, cabbage, and onions. Once baked, they turned golden and crisp on the outside, steaming with savory goodness on the inside. They were sturdy enough to fit in a coat pocket and stay warm through a morning's work in the fields or factory. The smell was rich and homey, the kind that reminded men of the kitchens they had left behind before dawn. For families, these hand pies were a practical miracle, stretching a bit of meat into several meals without waste. Each bite was soft, salty, and comforting, with the faint sweetness of cabbage tying it together. In towns where every penny mattered, these pies offered dignity to the table, a meal that looked humble but tasted like care. They carried with them the quiet pride of homemade food, something crafted by hand in a world that demanded strength and endurance. When unwrapped from a cloth napkin at lunchtime, they represented more than nourishment. They represented home, effort, and the unspoken bond of family waiting at day's end. Spicing meat with wild juniper and sage instead of store-bought seasonings was a mark of true culinary craftsmanship long before organic became a buzzword. Juniper berries with their sharp piney taste and sage leaves with their deep, smoky aroma were easy to find across wide swaths of native lands, and together they created one of the oldest and most unforgettable flavor combinations known to man. Hunters would rub juniper directly onto fresh meat before roasting it over fires, allowing the resins to seep into the flesh and protect it from bacteria while infusing it with mouth-watering flavor. Sage was burned, brewed, and crushed into spice blends that transformed even the toughest game meats into savory, aromatic feasts. And just when you think seasoning meat could not get any more poetic, native chefs took it one step further, discovering a way to use wild berries not just as food, but as a way to glaze and preserve fish in the most mouthwatering way imaginable. Pre-browning beef before casseroles was one of those small steps that changed the entire character of a dish. Grandma knew that tossing raw beef straight into a bake would leave it greasy, uneven, and heavy. By frying it first, carefully draining the fat, and sometimes seasoning it in the skillet, she created a clean, flavorful base. This simple act gave casseroles a deeper, richer taste, while also keeping the texture balanced so the final dish wasn't soggy or mushy. When paired with pasta, rice, or vegetables, that first step of browning ensured harmony among all the ingredients. Families grew used to casseroles that were hearty but never overwhelming, because technique mattered as much as thrift. It showed that skill in cooking didn't have to be elaborate. It was about respecting each step. Today, many recipes still include this instruction, though people sometimes skip it, forgetting why it mattered. Back then, it was common sense, part of the rhythm of daily cooking, a habit that quietly shaped meals we still remember fondly. Ketchup-glazed meat patties were weekday magic. No frills, no fuss, just ground beef, shaped into thick little patties, pan-fried to a crusty edge, and glazed with that one bottle every American kitchen had on standby. The glaze was simple: ketchup, maybe a little brown sugar or mustard if you were feeling creative, sometimes even a splash of vinegar or soy sauce for balance. Once the patties were nearly cooked through, that sticky sauce went right on top and bubbled into a sweet, savory layer that made each bite sing. Served with buttered noodles, canned corn, or instant mashed potatoes, this was the kind of dinner that came together fast and satisfied everyone at the table. And just when you think ketchup had claimed the crown for best beef topping, the next dish comes sizzling into view with a spoonful of gravy and a name borrowed from something a lot fancier than it turned out to be. Depression-era cabbage soup was survival in a pot. It began with water, not stock, and whatever scraps the week had left behind. A ham bone, a heel of onion, a wilted carrot. Cabbage went in by the handful, sliced thin to cook down soft, its sweetness turning broth into something more than it was. Ground beef or sausage might stretch across several meals, browned just enough to flavor the pot before being set aside for tomorrow. People called it soup, but it was more like resilience simmered on the stove. It filled the belly, warmed cold hands, and kept families fed through long winters when the pantry shelves were bare. The taste was humble, peppery, cabbage sweet, sometimes smoky if luck allowed, and yet no one complained. In those days, waste was unthinkable, and gratitude was constant. That pot of cabbage soup was not just dinner, it was hope you could eat. Ground beef and sweet potato fritters were the original fairground jackpot. Imagine rich, seasoned ground beef folded into a sweet potato batter, then fried up until the edges were crispy and golden. Every bite was this perfect balance of savory and sweet, crunchy and tender, like a county fair and your grandmother's kitchen teamed up for a once-in-a-lifetime collaboration. These fritters were cheap to make, easy to eat standing up, and good enough to make you chase the smell halfway across a dusty summer festival. It was the kind of food that made you forget about prize pigs and pie-eating contests for a minute and just stand there smiling like a fool. And if you think a fritter could stop you in your tracks, wait until you taste a skillet of beef simmered slow in a chokecherry reduction so rich and tangy it could turn a dusty prairie evening into something straight out of a storybook. Doubling portions with cabbage was one of those clever ideas that made a little beef feel like a feast. By shredding cabbage thin and frying it right alongside the ground beef, Grandma turned one modest pound of meat into a skillet brimming with flavor and substance. The cabbage absorbed the drippings, carrying the richness of the beef into every bite, while adding bulk that made plates look generous and complete. What could have been a small meal suddenly became a dish that felt abundant, filling the house with the smell of comfort as it simmered away. This trick also worked quietly to add vegetables into family meals, making them more balanced without anyone noticing. For children, it was simply dinner, but for adults, it was a careful solution to tight budgets. The sizzling pan of beef and cabbage often became the centerpiece of the table, warm and steaming with pride. Even today, beef and cabbage together carry a sense of hominess, proving that resourcefulness was just as powerful as extravagance when it came to feeding a family well. Salt harvesting from natural licks and how it changed food forever is one of those hidden stories that shaped survival more than we realize. In a world without grocery stores or factories, finding salt meant everything. Native American communities knew where the land bled salt, places where groundwater left behind crystals, or wild animals led the way to salt licks hidden deep in forests and valleys. They would collect the precious mineral by hand, scraping or boiling it out of muddy springs, then carefully drying and storing it for trade, cooking, and medicine. Salt preserved meats, flavored stews, and replenished bodies worn down by long journeys or brutal seasons. It was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. But salt was not the only way native chefs elevated their meals. When it came to pure, haunting flavor, they had another secret weapon: the living aroma of the woods themselves turned into smoke and magic. Beef and barley stew was built to last. One pot, one slow flame, and enough time to let the world outside freeze while the inside stayed warm. Ground beef browned first, then onions, carrots, barley, and water joined in. Nothing fancy, everything needed. As it simmered for hours, it thickened into a meal you could eat with a spoon or fork. The barley swelled, the cabbage softened, and the beef melted into the broth, turning a few scraps into something that tasted like plenty. It was food that nourished from the inside out, stretching a pound of meat across 3 days if it had to. Every kitchen had its version: more vegetables if the garden was kind, more water if times were lean. It was the taste of patience, of gratitude, and of winter's quiet victories. Cornmeal-dusted beef patties were the ultimate school lunch heroes back when cafeterias cooked meals from scratch and second helpings were won by speed and charm. Ground beef patties were seasoned simply: a little salt, a little pepper, maybe some onion powder if the lunch ladies were feeling generous, then dredged in cornmeal and fried until the outside got crispy and golden. It gave each patty a hearty crust that kept the juices locked inside, and biting into one was like getting a hug you could taste. Every kid had their own method of attack. Some piled everything into one glorious, messy stack. Others took slow, careful bites to make the moment last. And even though you knew there were better meals out there somewhere, none of them ever tasted quite like home the way these did. If you think that sounds like a trip back to better days, just wait until you hear about a skillet dish from the Great Lakes that blended beef, wild rice, and a little kitchen magic into pure home-style glory. Mixing in peanut butter for savory stew was one of those surprising wartime tricks that made sense once you tried it. Peanut butter was affordable, shelf-stable, and packed with protein, so it became a clever addition when meat was scarce. Stirred into a beef stew, it thickened the broth and gave it a nutty richness that made the dish feel heartier. It wasn't about making the stew taste like peanuts, but about adding depth and body to the flavor. Families often didn't even know the secret ingredient, only that the meal tasted comforting and filling. This hack proved that resourcefulness could be creative, turning an ordinary stew into something unique. It also showed how flexible ingredients could be when money and rations were tight. Today, the idea might sound unusual, but for Grandma, it was a quiet way to make sure her family got the nourishment they needed without feeling like they were missing out. Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski style, was comfort born in coal country. It came from immigrant kitchens where butter, onions, and cabbage were fried together until caramelized, then tossed with noodles and bits of ground beef. The result was smoky, soft, and faintly sweet, a dish that felt like warmth itself. It was cheap to make, easy to love, and could feed a crowd for pennies. In Pennsylvania, mining towns, and Midwest kitchens, Pulaski became more than a meal. It was memory on a plate. The sizzle of cabbage hitting butter, the smell of onions browning in old cast iron carried a rhythm of tradition. Even without meat, it was satisfying. With it, it became a small feast, Served in big enamel bowls, it spoke of perseverance, of families who worked hard, prayed often, and found joy wherever they could. Ground beef stew with hickory smoked potatoes was the flavor of comfort when comfort was in short supply. Ground beef was browned nice and slow, not rushed like today's microwave world, and then simmered with chunks of hickory smoked potatoes that tasted like they had been hanging out at a backyard barbecue all day long. The potatoes picked up every bit of beefy, smoky goodness until they practically melted into the stew, making every spoonful thicker, richer, and somehow even more comforting than the last. It was the kind of meal you made when you needed to fill every belly in the house without breaking the bank or spending the whole night hovering over the stove. And if you thought a simple stew could take you right back to the kitchen tables of the 1980s, just wait until you hear about the chili that turned strips of old-school beef jerky into a reservation-style legend with a brand-new twist. Which forgotten ground beef dish will you rescue from the past? Share your grandparents' best hamburger secrets in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another taste of how families used to stretch $1.